Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Uncle Mike for an extraordinary welcome to country. Welcome everyone, and we know that there's a couple of empty seats. I think there are some people with some spanners in Victoria trying to sort a few things out. We wish them well. We'll see them during the course of the next day or two. It's lovely to have the opportunity to meet those of you I don't already know. We have a lot of guests from all over the country and from other parts of the world who are joining us. As you know, we have keynote speeches from two of our great friends from the Energy Trust of Oregon, and Michael is the lead of the organisation here, and you'll hear much from him tomorrow. It's interesting, he and I were speaking on Monday, and he asked me a question that stayed with me for a while. And the question was, what are the great successes in Australian social policy, great transformative agendas for Australia? And I was a bit nonplussed initially, because I think Australians don't often talk about their successes in this regard. They don't often engage with their history. But then I sort of got to thinking, and then it sort of poured out. I recall, of course, some of the great political successes. Remember the Commonwealth Franchise Act in 1902, where the vote and membership of Parliament and representation was extended to women in Australia, the first country on the earth to do that, recognising, of course, that didn't include Indigenous people for another several generations. And there are many, many more of these. I was reminded of post-war migration, of course, and then the native title developments, starting with the Yolngu people in the 1962, 1963, I think, with the Yirrkala bark being presented to federal parliament, and then Vincent Lingiari and Eddie Mabo and others. Extraordinary social changes. And then, of course, we move into the 60s and the 70s and 80s with the changes in regard to the access to justice initiatives. And many of the organisations represented here came to life in that period, whether it's legal aid, community legal centres, ombudsman bodies and others. And this was also the period, of course, of the establishment of Medibank and then Medicare, an extraordinary contribution to the Australian system. And then we go on to superannuation and so on, the NDIS maybe in 2013. And there are multiple examples of transformative policy in Australia that we can all be deeply proud of. What is interesting to me, as Louise may have mentioned to you, I've been in the job now for about 4 months, and I've heard a lot of people say that the energy transformation that we're currently undergoing won't be on that list, that it's too complex, that we are fatigued, that it's too hotly contested a space for that level of success, for that rewriting of a national narrative. But I'm not so sure. Because I think when we put our minds to things in this country, good things happen. It's just that kind of place. And that excites me, and frankly, that's the reason that I came and joined this team here at ECA, because I think the opportunity to recraft the energy narrative in Australia, as much as recognising the potential for energy as a human right, is an exciting proposition. And there's nowhere that I and the team would rather be. But I'm not naive. I recognise the level of challenge. You know, I have heard a lot of frustration since I've been in the job from people particularly saying that after all the talk of transformation, that some of the original verities, some of the original voices in this market, the dominant voices are reasserting themselves, and that the status quo will eventually return. I'm not so sure. We have heard also just the level of fatigue that we've all lived through over the last 20 years in regard to the climate wars, and whether genuine leadership is possible or advisable if there's anyone going to put their head over the parapet on energy policy in Australia, recognising how many heads have been removed for doing that very thing. Again, I'm not so sure. I don't think we would have a sellout crowd if this was a space that people didn't feel that they wanted to be because they believed in it. And the other really is a level of ambition. People say to me, well, we're just not ambitious enough. that the climb is too steep and the opportunity is too distant and all we can see is the challenge. That may be true, but somehow it seems to me each one of these enormous social achievements that I talked about earlier probably looked much the same at the time. This isn't our first civilization level challenge that we're facing, and I would suggest it's probably unlikely to be the last. But I'm enough of an optimist, I guess, to believe very firmly that we're up for the challenge. And in fact, we've had 300,000 years to develop our problem resolution skills. It's what we're good at, is addressing these kinds of challenges and turning them into enormous opportunities. It has to be said, though, and you heard a little of this morning, that in recent years, particularly through the period of the pandemic, we saw, to mix the metaphors, we saw some of the cracks in our social fabric open up. And there's a very real chance that if we can't design this transformation in a way that reflects the best part of our character, those cracks will open into fissures. And if I'm frank with you, that's probably the thing that I'm most concerned about. It is expensive to be poor in the Australian energy system. We do live in a world in which access to power and the protections that undergird that supply are not universally shared or enjoyed across the country. And this is something I think that we should be staring into and asking ourselves as a society, how comfortable are we with that level of disparity? So while I think this transformation will quite rightly test our resilience, our resolve, it will also force us to ask questions about our level of care for one another, our level of compassion. What is shared humanity when it comes to an energy system? I don't intend to speak for a long time this morning because you didn't come here to hear from me. But there's one favour that I have to ask of you in regard to today and tomorrow and the discussions we'll have. And that is, if you're able somehow to confound the verities that you bring to sort of, if you like, disrupt those logics, those patterns of thought that you've somehow developed, that you've grown into, that you've studied, that you exert on a daily basis in your professional lives, come here and do me the favour of trying something new, thinking outside of the paradigm that you would otherwise bring with you. Because that's what it's about. We don't here want nearsightedness, we want foresightedness. That's what this is about. And I think the opportunity of having 200 people who are expert and energised and who care, exerting their minds and their passions on these problems is exactly the kind of thing that will make the difference that Louise was asking us to achieve. So I have a couple of final thoughts. And the first of those is what the world might look like if we were able to exert our design choices on the energy transformation. And this is a process that those of us at Energy Consumers Australia are working through at the moment. And I know at the Cool Kids table over there in the corner, my colleagues will recall we're working on 37 problems, which seems a lot, and it is. But each one of these needs to be present and responded to in order to ensure a just transition. So I thought I might mention a couple of the areas that we're thinking about. And I'm not going to throw solutions at you, A, because I'm not qualified to do that, you are, and B, because the job is for you to contemplate what those solutions might be. And we will hear some great examples of best practice solutions tomorrow, particularly from some of our invited guests and others. But the first I wanted to ask you is, what would a world look like if energy genuinely was considered a right. Now, I'm not necessarily pushing that into the legislative space, but I would say we talk about energy as an essential. In fact, some of our regulators call themselves essential services. We are signatories to the UN sustainability goals, and for those of you who are writing submissions, and I certainly hope all of you do, to the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy, you will know, as Kerry keeps reminding me, there's a wonderful phrase that talks about clean, reliable energy as a human right. But I find it hard to reconcile that with a context in which many of those same communities don't have the consumer protections that you and I have, where the rates, for example, of disconnection are astronomically high, the kind of international records that we wouldn't want to achieve. And it seems to me, for instance, that there might well be other alternatives to trying to recover payment than simply turning off the spigot if it's an essential service. That's something that I would be interested to hear your views on. Another world that we're contemplating is one in which the largest generator in the country, which is us, the people who do have rooftop solar, for example, somehow wake into their power and realise, as Louise said, there is an enormous opportunity for the Australian community to recognise its investment and have that investment fully realised in terms of fair treatment and fair pricing. We feel very strongly that the investments that people have made need to be honoured, and that this partnership that you heard of Louise talking about can be a dynamic and indeed wonderful element of a new and engaging and transformative energy solution. I also wonder about a world in which energy efficiency is redefined not as a consumer obligation, because consumers are busy and it's hard, and often they don't have the capacity to move in the way that people would like them to. Their behaviour, as Louisa said, may have failed in classic economic terms. But perhaps energy efficiency is something that we can contemplate at an industry level, and whether in fact the identification of efficiency can be something that industry looks to and is obliged to identify and determine. And indeed, if energy efficiency as a first fuel becomes the first thing in the cost stack that a pricing regulator would be looking for, that our energy efficiency becomes contested, and that energy companies would want to compete to access my energy efficiency because it is the lowest cost mechanism to reduce their capacity build and to ensure a reliable system. I think there's enormous opportunities there. Another world that we're contemplating is one in which there's some level of national narrative that brings together all of us in a space that has been very hard to occupy. And for all of you who have, or for those of you who have been in the climate and energy domain over the last 10 or 20 years, hats off. A hard place to be. We do feel that Australian consumers are looking for a narrative that encapsulates them, that brings them into this domain, and where, in fact, there can be a clarion call to common sense policy, where allyship can be a fundamental mechanism to create a trusted system and a trusting system. And where, as we heard from Uncle Mike this morning, the sun, the wind, the water become emblematic of our success and our wealth as a nation, and where we can actually feel on our skin the source of our power. I think that is an exciting opportunity. There are others. One that we are thinking about very seriously at the moment, about the gas network, for example, is a world in which there isn't a cruel challenge that when the music stops, the people without a chair pay for those who've got a chair. The challenge that we have is that as people move away from the gas network, for instance, there has to be a mechanism for those who cannot to affordably provide energy to their homes. These are big policy challenges, and we're looking for everyone in this room to help us in formulating our thinking on these things. Last couple of things. Kerry tells me that there's an idiom that is often used in the sector that Australian homes often have the energy efficiency of a tent. I had not heard that, but I've been researching it quite a bit, and unfortunately for many, it's quite probably true. Homes before 2003 have a 1.7 average star rating out of a possible 10. I think it's minimum 7 now, isn't it? There are remarkable things that can be done to help Australians thermal proof their homes and to create a context in where people aren't paying enormous retail sums because they live in places that are simply inefficient to occupy. And the last thing I was going to say, I guess, is that we are very committed to a world in which consumers have access to the right information about the right product at the right time and in the right place for them. We think Australians are calling out for a mechanism for them to engage with this myriad energy policy that is inexorably moving towards them. And we're very much hoping that some of the conversations that we'll have over the next 2 days will provide for you a good case study of what could work well in Australia. But the first thing is to ask consumers what it is they want and they think. And so I thought we might play for you, just for a couple of minutes, a bit of a vox pop that the team did not far from here. It might give you an idea of what a few people are saying they require from the energy transition. So perhaps we can play.
How do you feel about Australia's renewable energy transition?
I don't think it's going fast enough.
A bit behind the 8 ball. You look at what's happening internationally, I think Australia definitely needs to get with the times a bit.
I think that my main concern is the focus that the government still have on all the carbon and all the non-renewable sources of energy and the harm on the environment.
The current transition to renewables could be better by, I think, expanding it, including nuclear.
And what concerns you about that, the transition to renewable energy?
Just the cost mainly that we've got to outlay, and our bills seem to be going up. Everything seems to be made overseas and we're buying it.
There needs to be a good balance between personal versus corporations. People transitioning in a home is one thing, but I think also there needs to be a lot of pressure on larger corporations because what they're producing is such a huge scale.
Have you thought about switching away from gas at home?
Not really.
Are you aware that gas is a fossil fuel at all?
Yes, however, I'm more comfortable with using gas for gas stoves for cooking.
Have you thought about changing your gas appliances over to electric?
I'm being a bit negative, but we got a swimming pool spa that's gas heated.
And do you use gas here at all?
No gas, just purely electric. The business didn't have gas when I took the lease. I looked at getting gas installed, but the cost to get gas from the street was around $5,000 to $6,000. We're not going to spend that.
I have one, which is hot water, which I recently changed to, regrettably, because since then I've transitioned to solar energy and have changed the rest of my appliances to electric.
And why did you choose to change to a gas appliance?
It was a mistake on my part. I should have been a little bit more forward thinking.
I'm a renter, so I don't have much of a choice.
I would probably use electric if I had enough money to have my own home. Yeah.
It will take me a while to get around to it.
I think it would be good to know like the overall impact that would have on emissions, like if there was some sort of like quantified information that was provided. So it was like if you and this many people transition from gas to electricity, like this would be the impact on carbon emissions.
There you are, just some views of literally people walking past the street. We hope you enjoy the next couple of days. Please give us your best thoughts, your most creative ideas. And on that front, I've got the great task of introducing Audrey Ziebelman, who I think it's fair to say is well known to everyone here, and also our head of communications and stakeholder engagement, Liz Stevens. Thank you very much.